This is the presentational video by group number 6 on the chapter Neural Control and Coordination. Major topics written here are the chapter checklist. If to talk about coordination, coordination is the process through which two or more organs interact and their functions are coordinated to each other. For example, like when we do physical exercises, what we require are the energy and oxygen supplement. And when we stop exercising, gradually the activities of our lungs, heart, kidneys, etc. will return to their normal condition. Hence, all the functions of muscles, lungs, heart, etc. are all coordinated to each other. In our body, the neural system and the endocrine system integrate the activities of our organs. Neural system consists of organized networks which are connected point to point in turn for a quick coordination, whereas endocrine system provides chemical integration through hormones. Next, to talk about neural system. Neural system is composed of highly specialized cells called neurons, which can detect, receive, and transmit different kinds of stimuli in our body. The neural organization in the lower vertebrate is quite simple. For example, in Hydra, it is composed of a network of neurons. The neural system is much better organized in insects, where it consists of a brain along with a number of ganglia and neural tissues, and is much more developed in a vertebrate. Human neural system, it is of two types, central and a peripheral neural system, whereas the central nervous system has brain and a spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system has autonomous and a somatic nervous system, in which the autonomous nervous system has sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. As mentioned above, the central nervous system consists of a brain and a spinal cord, in which both of those are the site of information processing and control. There are two nerve fibers of PNS, which are afferent fibers and afferent fibers. The afferent fiber transmit the impulses from tissue or organs to the central nervous system, whereas the afferent fibers transmit regulatory impulses from the CNS to the needed peripheral tissue or organs. Next is the peripheral nervous system, which comprises of all nerves associated with the brain and the spinal cord. There are two types, which are the somatic and autonomic nervous system, in which somatic nervous system transfers the impulses from the CNS to the skeletal muscles, whereas the autonomic nervous system transmits impulses from the central nervous system to the involuntary organs and smooth muscles of the body. And the autonomic nervous system is further classified into two subgroups, which are sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And visceral nervous system is also the part of the peripheral nervous system, which consists of whole complex of nerves, fibers, ganglia, by which the impulses travel from the central nervous system to the viscera. If to talk about neuron, it is a structural and functional unit of neural system, and it is also a microscopic structure composed of three major parts, which are cell body, dendrite, and axon. The cell body contains cytoplasm with cell organelles and certain granular bodies called nuclear bodies. And dendrites are the short fibers which are constantly branched and are outside of the cell body, which also contain nuclear granules which house in the transmitting the impulses towards the cell body. And last, the axon, it is the long fiber which is at the end, in which it is also branched. Axon transmit nerve impulses away from the cell body to a neuromuscular junction which is also known as synapse. Based on the number of axons in dendrite, the neurons are divided into three types. First is the multipolar neurons, which contain with one axon and two more dendrites. Example, neurons of cerebral cortex. And second one is the bipolar neurons, which contain one axon and one dendrite. Example, neurons found in the retina of eye. And third one is the unipolar neurons, which contain cell body with one axon. Example, neurons found in embryonic stage. And there are also two types of axon, myelinated and non-myelinated. Each branch of the axon terminates as a bulb-like structure called synaptic nerve, in which it possesses the synaptic vesicle, which contains the chemical called neurotransmitters. And the myelinated nerve fibers are enveloped with the Schwann cell, in which it forms a myelinated sheath around the axon. Example, nerve fibers found in the spinal and the cranial nerves have myelin sheath, whereas the unmyelinated nerve fibers is enclosed by the Schwann cell that does not form a myelin sheath around the axon. Example, nerve fibers found in the autonomous and the somatic nervous system, in which, in conclusion, the main difference between the myelinated and the unmyelinated nerve fibers is the presence of the myelin sheath. The gaps between the two adjacent myelin sheaths are called nodes of Van Weyl, and the neurons are the excitable cells because their membranes are in the polarized state.
Greetings to all, I'm Tinzyuju, and today I'll be explaining about the generation and conduction of nerve impulse. Different types of ion channels are present on the neural membrane, which makes them excitable cells. When a neuron is in the resting state, the axonal membrane is comparatively more permeable to potassium ions and nearly impermeable to sodium ions and negatively charged proteins present in the exoplasm. Therefore, the exoplasm inside the axon contains a high concentration of potassium ions and negatively charged proteins and low concentration of sodium ions. In contrast, the fluid outside the axon contains a low concentration of potassium ions and a high concentration of sodium ions, therefore forming a concentration gradient. Active transportation of ions takes place through the membrane via the sodium-potassium pump, in which 2 potassium ions enter the cell and 3 sodium ions are transported outwards. As a result, the inner surface is negatively charged and outer surface is positively charged, being in a polarized state. The electric potential difference across the resting plasma membrane is called as the resting potential. When a stimulus is applied at a site on the polarized membrane, the membrane at the site A becomes freely permeable to sodium ions, which leads to rapid influx of sodium ions followed by the reversal of the polarity at that site. The membrane is depolarized. The electric potential difference across the plasma membrane is called action potential, which is termed as nerve impulse. Depolarization is followed by the increase in permeability of potassium ions to the membrane, leading to change in polarization, and the process is called repolarization, and the membrane is repolarized. During depolarization, the outer surface of the membrane becomes negatively charged and the inner side becomes positively charged. During repolarization, outside of membrane becomes positively charged and inside becomes negative.
Hi everyone, I am Kunga Chindan. I am going to share you some about neural system. I'm going to talk about transmission of impulse and introduction on central neural system. Transmission of impulse. A nerve impulse is transmitted from one neuron to another through junctions called synapses. A synapse is formed by the membranes of a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron, which may or may not be separated by a gap called synaptic cleft. This diagram shows the axon terminal and synapse. There are 2 types of synapses: electrical synapses and chemical synapses. At electrical synapses, the membranes of pre- and postsynaptic neurons are in very close proximity, and electrical current can flow directly from one neuron into the other across these synapses. Impulse transmission across an electrical synapse is always faster than that across a chemical synapse. At a chemical synapse, the membranes of the pre- and postsynaptic neurons are separated by a fluid-filled space called synaptic cleft. Chemicals called neurotransmitters are involved in the transmission of impulses at synapses. The axon terminals contains vesicles filled with these neurotransmitters. When an impulse arrives at the axon terminal, it stimulates the movement of the synaptic vesicles toward the membrane where they fuse with the plasma membrane and release their neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft. The released neurotransmitters bind to their specific receptors present on the postsynaptic membrane, which opens ion channels, allowing the entry of ions which can generate a new potential in the postsynaptic neuron. Now let's get to central nervous system. This diagram shows the sagittal section of the human brain. The brain is the central information processing organ of our body and acts as the command and control system. The human brain is well protected by the skull. Inside the skull, the brain is covered by cranial meninges consisting of an outer layer called neura mater, a very thin middle layer called arachnoid, and an inner layer called pia mater. The brain can be divided into three major parts: forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain. And that was still my part. Thank you for the attention.
Hello friends, let's play a small game. Instruction is, you have to know the color of letter but not the words. Are you ready? So here we go. Was this confusing? But it's okay, everyone does. So let's come back to the brain, central nervous system. As they mentioned, brain and spinal cords are the composed of central nervous system. I'm going to talk about brain. The brain is the central information processing organ of our body and acts as the command and control system. It controls the voluntary movements, balance of the body, functioning of the vital, involuntary organs. Also thermoregulation and processing of vision and etc. So if we talk about the structure of brain, the brain is well protected by the skull. Inside the skull, the brain is covered by cranial meninges, consisting of an outer layer called dura mater, a very thin layer called arachnoid, and an inner layer called pia mater, which is in contact with the brain tissue. The brain can be divided into three major parts. Those are forebrain, middle brain, hindbrain. So let's discuss those in detail. Forebrain. Forebrain is the largest part of the brain, which consists of cerebrum, thalamus, hypothalamus. Cerebrum. Cerebrum forms a major part of the human brain. A deep cleft divides the cerebrum longitudinally into two halves, which are termed as the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Hemispheres are connected by tract of nerve fibers called corpusculum. The cell which covers the cerebral hemisphere is called cerebral cortex, and it's thrown into the permanent fold. Cerebral cortex also refers to as the grey matter due to its squarish appearance. The cerebral cortex consists motor area, sensory area, and association areas. Association areas are responsibility for the complex function like intersensory association, memory, and communication. Meninges, which constitute the inner part of the cerebral hemisphere, the white appearance to the layer called white matter. The cerebrum web around the structure is called thalamus. It is major coordinating center for sensory and motor signaling. Another very important part of the brain called hypothalamus lies at the base of the thalamus. Hypothalamus controls the body temperature and arc for eating and drinking. It also contains several groups of neurosecretory cells which produce hypothalamic hormones. Collection of structures within the forebrain includes amygdala, hippocampus, etc. forms a complex structure called the limbic lobe or limbic system. Limbic system, along with the hypothalamus, it is responsibility for the sexual behavior and expression of the emotional reactions and motivation and etc. Second, midbrain. It is located between the thalamus, hypothalamus of the forebrain and bone of the hindbrain. Cerebral aqueduct, which contains cerebral spinal fluid, passes through the midbrain, and also it connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle of the brain, which is also called the aqueduct of the Sylvius. The dorsal portion of the midbrain consists mainly four round swellings or loops called corpora cortigemina. It contains reflex center of vision and hearing. So, midbrain and hindbrain forms the brainstem. It acts as a realization for the auditory and visual information. That is, every impulse conducted between the brain and spinal cord. If we talk about hindbrain, its form of pons, cerebrum, and medulla or medulla oblongata. The bone, which consists of fiber tracts that interconnect different organs of the brain. The convoluted surface of the cerebrum provides lots of space to accommodate the max number of the neuron. This part of the brain is responsibility for the coordinated body movement or balance of the body. The medulla oblongata act as a link between brain and spinal cord. The centers of medulla oblongata act as involuntary activities such as respiration, blood pressure, cardiovascular reflexes, and gastric secretions. I had finished about the three major parts of the brain, and now I'm going to talk about reflex action and reflex arc. So you might notice that we react externally when we come to the contact with extremely hot or cold object or something poisonous or etc. So this quick and immediate involuntary response to an external stimulus that occurs without any conscious effort or thoughts is called reflex action. Such a reaction requires involvement only parts of central nervous system, mostly the spinal cord. The part through which action is conducted is also called reflex arc. It consists of receptor, sensory or afferent neuron and interneuron or association neuron, motor or afferent neuron and effector organ. So afferent neuron receives signal from the sensory organs and transmit the impulse via a dorsal nerve roots or sensory nerves into the spinal cord. The spinal cord, the sensory neural system, is connected to the association neuron, which transmits the stimulus to the effector neuron. Then afferent neuron passes the stimulus into effector organ, such as muscle, to the ventral nerve cord. Such a reflex arc consistent by passing impulse transmission to the brain, and thus it helps us to avoid pain. Thank you.
Hello, so I'm going to talk on the sensory organ and processing. Sensory organ detects all the types of changes in environment and it gives signals to the central neuron systems, which all the inputs are processed and analyzed. The sensory organ for vision is eye, and for the hearing it is ear, and for smell it is nose. The olfactory receptors are found in the nose, which is specialized for the receiving the sense of smell. And the neuron of the olfactory epitheliums are extends from the outside the environment, which get directly into the pair of broad brain size organ called olfactory bulb and are extensions of brain limbic system. And the next point is both senses of taste and smells are quite similar and interrelated. And the next one is taste buds is used for tongue to detect the taste of which contain a gustatory reception. Human eyeball are spherical in structure. The wall of eyeball is composed of three layers. First, the outermost sclera, which is dense connective tissue. Second, middle choroid supplied with blood vessels. And last, innermost retina. Choroid has thin layer over the posterior two-thirds of eyeball, but ciliary body it becomes thick. In front of ciliary body, the choroid becomes widely separated from cornea, forming a visible colored portion of the eye known as iris. A solid transparent crystalline biconvex lens is present, which is just behind the pupil and is held by ligaments that are attached to ciliary body. There are three layer neuron cells in retina. The first one is ganglion cell, and the second one is bipolar cell, and the third one is photoreceptor cell. There are two types of photoreceptor cells, which is called cones and rods. They both are sensitive. They both are light sensitive proteins. Cones are sensitive to the bright lights of high intensity and color vision, whereas the rods are more sensitive to the dim lights. And the protein present in the rod is called the rod spin. And cones respond to color, which is red, green, and blue. The nerve connecting the eye to brain is called optic, and there is absence of photoreceptors in this region, hence it is called a blind spot.
The ear by Noun Dranke, Group 6. The ear not only helps in hearing but also helps in maintaining our body balance. It can be further divided into three parts: outer ear, middle ear, and inner ear. On the outer ear, there is a funnel-like structure from the outer to the middle ear called the pinna. And there's an S-shaped tube called the external auditory meatus. and there are very fine hair and wax secreting sebaceous glands present on the skin of pinna, which helps in preventing dust from entering the air. Pinna is also responsible for collecting vibrations in the air and directing the sounds to the meatus, extending to the middle ear. Then moving on to the next, the middle ear. It consists of air-filled space called the tympanic cavity that separates the outer and inner ear. The tympanic cavity is bounded externally by a tympanic membrane, also known as the eardrum. The tympanic membrane is composed of connective tissues that is covered with skin outside and mucous membrane inside, and it is bounded internally by an auditory capsule. The middle ear also has 3 small movable bones or ossicles called the malleus, incus, and stapes on the floor of the tympanic cavity. These ossicles are connected to each other in a chain-like fashion, which increase the efficiency of transmission of sound waves to the inner ear. They also maintain the air pressure on both sides of the eardrum, which is done by the eustachian tube that connects the tympanic cavity to the pharynx. Inner ear. It consists of complex system of intercommunicating chambers and tubes called the labyrinth, with 2 functional parts, cochlea, responsible for hearing, and vestibular apparatus for body balance. The labyrinth is of 2 types, bony labyrinth and membranous labyrinth. The bony labyrinth is a series of channels filled with a fluid called perilymph, while membranous lies within the bony labyrinth and is filled with endolymph. Cochlea is the coiled portion of the bony labyrinth. The cochlea in turn has 2 membranes, the Resner's membrane and basilar membrane. They both divide the bony labyrinth into upper section called the scala vestibuli and lower section called the scala tympani. In membranous labyrinth, the space between scalar vestibuli and scala tympani is called the scala media, which is filled with endolymph. Organ of Corti is an organ of the inner ear located within the cochlea. It is present in the scala media, which is the actual receptor of sound. It is composed of hair cells which act as auditory receptors. Above the row of hair cells lies a thin elastic membrane called the tectorial membrane. Inner ear also contains a complex system called the vestibular apparatus that helps in maintaining our body balance. It is located above the cochlea and consists of 3 semicircular canals and the otolith organ. Each semicircular canal is C-shaped, suspended in perilymph. The modern base of this canal is called the ampulla. It contains a sensory spot called the crista ampullaris, and then the sacule and utricle also contain a sensory spot called the macula. Mechanism of hearing. The external ear receives sound waves and then directs it to the eardrum. The eardrum then vibrates and transmits the sound waves through the ear ossicles, which amplify the sound and pass down the vibration through the oval window to the fluid of cochlea. It generates the sound waves in the lymph that induces a ripple in the basilar membrane. Then the vibrations of basilar membrane bend the hair cells, pressing them against the tectorial membrane. The hairs move back and forth, which stimulates the hair cells or receptor cells. As a result, hair cells generate nerve impulses which are transmitted along afferent nerve fibers and to auditory nerves to the auditory cortex of the brain. Then the brain interprets nerve impulses and the sounds are recognized. Thank you.